The rain hammered against the windows of Morgan Chen's downtown apartment as she stared at her phone screen with mounting dread. Her mother's text message glowed accusingly in the darkness. "Your grandmother is asking about the wedding again. She doesn't have much time left, sweetheart. Please don't break her heart." Morgan's fingers hovered over the keyboard, trembling slightly as she considered her options. For 6 months, she had been maintaining an elaborate fiction about her engagement to a woman named Sarah, a convenient lie she had constructed during a particularly uncomfortable family dinner when her aunts wouldn't stop setting her up with their friends' sons. The problem was that Sarah didn't exist, and now her grandmother's declining health had accelerated everyone's expectations for a wedding that could never happen. Morgan squeezed her eyes shut, fighting back the familiar wave of guilt and panic that had become her constant companion since this deception began spiraling out of control. Across town, Detective Riley Hayes sat in her unmarked sedan, surveillance photos spread across her dashboard like a macabre puzzle she couldn't solve. The Thompson case had gone cold 3 years ago, but Riley wouldn't let it go, even after her captain had officially closed the investigation and reassigned her to current cases. A young woman had vanished without a trace from a charity gala, her champagne glass still half full on the table, her purse and phone left behind, as if she had simply evaporated into thin air. Riley studied the grainy security footage for the 1,000th time, watching the victim, Jennifer Thompson, laughing with friends mere hours before she disappeared forever into the Seattle night. The case had consumed Riley's life, cost her a relationship, and nearly derailed her career, but something in her gut told her the truth was still out there, waiting to be uncovered. She rubbed her tired eyes and reached for her cold coffee, knowing she should go home but unable to tear herself away from the evidence that haunted her dreams. Morgan finally typed out a response to her mother. "Sarah and I will be there for grandmother's birthday next month. I promise." She hit send before she could second-guess herself, then immediately felt the familiar knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach as she realized what she had just committed to doing. The birthday party would be a full family gathering: aunts, uncles, cousins, her parents, and worst of all, her sharp-eyed grandmother, who could spot a lie from across a crowded room despite her failing health. Morgan stood and walked to her window, watching the city lights blur through the rain-streaked glass as she mentally calculated how much time she had to either confess the truth or find a solution to this impossible situation. Confessing wasn't really an option. Her grandmother had been so genuinely happy when Morgan had finally announced she was marrying a woman, validating years of subtle hints about Morgan's sexuality that the family had pretended not to notice. That joy in her grandmother's eyes, that acceptance and love, had made the life feel almost worth it in the moment, but now Morgan was trapped in a web of her own making. The idea came to Morgan at 3 in the morning, born of desperation and too much wine, as she scrolled mindlessly through social media to distract herself from her spiraling thoughts. She could hire someone, an actress, maybe, or just someone who needed money and could play a convincing role for a few hours at a family party. It was absurd, the plot of a bad romantic comedy, but Morgan found herself opening her laptop and searching for actors for hire Seattle, with the kind of manic energy that comes from sleep deprivation and panic. The search results were surprisingly numerous: background actors, improv performers, people advertising themselves for parties and events, even a few escort services that she quickly scrolled past with a flush of embarrassment. Morgan created a throwaway email account and began crafting a post for a local acting forum, trying to make the request sound professional and not completely insane. Seeking actress for one-day family event performance. Must be comfortable with LGBTQ+ storyline. Excellent pay for the right candidate. Discretion required. Riley's phone buzzed with a text from her former partner on the Thompson case, Marcus Webb, who had moved to the FBI's Seattle field office last year. "Found something. Meet me at the usual place. 8 a.m. Riley's heart rate immediately kicked up as she checked the time. It was already 6 in the morning, which meant she had been sitting in her car outside the victim's former apartment building all night again, lost in the case files and photographs that had become her obsession. She started the engine, her mind already racing through possibilities of what Marcus might have discovered after all this time in the cold case that had defined and derailed both of their careers. The Thompson disappearance had never made sense. There was no evidence of foul play, no ransom demand, no body, no credible sightings, just a successful young architect who had vanished into thin air during a crowded charity event in front of hundreds of witnesses who somehow saw nothing. Riley headed home to shower and change, her exhaustion temporarily forgotten in the surge of hope that maybe, finally, they might catch a break in the case that refused to let her go. Morgan woke to 17 responses to her anonymous post, which had been live for less than 5 hours on the acting forum where desperate performers sought any paid work they could find. She scrolled through them with growing dismay. Most were clearly not right for the role, including 3 men who apparently hadn't read the description carefully and several women whose profile pictures showed they looked nothing like the fictional Sarah she had been describing to her family for months. Then she found a message from someone who signed simply as RH. Brief, professional, and intriguing. I'm not an actress, but I need the money and I'm very good at reading people and adapting to situations. Former theater kid, current professional who needs a side gig. I'm gay, I'm Chinese American, I'm in my early 30s, and I can be whoever you need me to be for a day. Let's talk. Morgan stared at the message, something about its directness and honesty cutting through the anxiety that had been building in her chest since she had posted the ad in a moment of wine-fueled desperation. She hit reply before she could talk herself out of it. Coffee tomorrow? I'll send details about what I need. The coffee shop Morgan chose was deliberately neutral territory, a quiet place in Capitol Hill, far enough from her apartment and office that she wouldn't run into anyone she knew, but public enough that meeting a stranger from the internet felt reasonably safe. She arrived 15 minutes early, claimed a corner table with a view of the door, and ordered a latte she wouldn't drink, her stomach too twisted with nerves to handle caffeine on top of everything else. Morgan had stayed up half the night rehearsing what she would say, how she would explain this ridiculous situation without sounding completely unhinged, how she would gauge whether this RH person was trustworthy enough to bring into her family's life, even temporarily and under false pretenses. She checked her phone obsessively, half hoping the stranger wouldn't show up, so she could abandon this insane plan and just confess everything to her family, consequences be damned. But at exactly 10 o'clock, the coffee shop door opened, and a woman walked in who made Morgan's carefully prepared speech evaporate from her mind completely. Tall, dark hair pulled back in a casual ponytail, sharp eyes that swept the room with the practiced assessment of someone trained to notice details, wearing jeans and a leather jacket that suggested someone who was comfortable in her own skin in a way Morgan had never quite managed to be herself. Riley spotted Morgan immediately. The other woman had the nervous energy of someone about to do something either very brave or very stupid, fingers drumming against her coffee cup in an anxious rhythm that Riley recognized from countless interrogation rooms. She approached the table with the same calm confidence she brought to witness interviews, already reading Morgan's body language and forming preliminary assessments before a single word was exchanged between them. Morgan Chen? Riley asked, extending her hand in greeting as she reached the corner table where the younger woman sat looking like she might bolt at any moment. Morgan nodded, her eyes widening slightly as she took in Riley's appearance, and Riley caught the flicker of surprise followed by something else. Attraction, maybe, or just relief that Riley looked reasonably normal and not like a potential serial killer responding to cryptic internet advertisements. They shook hands, and Riley felt the slight tremor in Morgan's grip, the clamminess of her palm that betrayed her nervousness despite the composed expression she was clearly trying to maintain. Riley sat down across from her, ordering a black coffee from the passing barista before turning her full attention to Morgan with the same focused intensity she brought to all her investigations, not yet realizing that this seemingly simple side job would collide catastrophically with the case that had consumed her life for 3 years. Morgan found herself momentarily unable to speak, caught off guard by the woman sitting across from her. RH was nothing like what she had imagined from the brief email exchange they had conducted in the early morning hours. There was something commanding about Riley's presence, an intensity in her gaze that made Morgan feel simultaneously exposed and protected, as if this stranger could see through all her carefully constructed defenses, but might not judge her too harshly for what she found beneath them. "Thank you for meeting me," Morgan finally managed, her voice coming out steadier than she felt as she wrapped both hands around her cooling latte for something to anchor herself to in this surreal situation. "I know my post was vague, and I appreciate you responding, even though you said you're not an actress, which honestly might be better for what I need anyway." She was rambling now, a nervous habit she had never quite managed to break, words spilling out faster as her anxiety increased with each passing second. Riley just watched her with patient attention, not interrupting or judging, which somehow made Morgan want to tell her everything. The lie, the guilt, her grandmother's illness, the impossible situation she had created for herself through 6 months of compounding deception. Riley listened as Morgan explained her situation, the detective in her automatically cataloging details and inconsistencies, even as the human part of her felt unexpected sympathy for this woman who had painted herself into such an elaborate corner. The story was absurd, pretending to be engaged for family approval, maintaining the fiction for months, now needing someone to play the fake fiancé at a grandmother's birthday party. But Riley had seen enough of human nature in her years on the force to know that people did stranger things for stranger reasons when it came to family and acceptance. "So you need me to pretend to be Sarah, your fictional fiancé, for one day at a family party," Riley summarized, her analytical mind already identifying the potential complications and logistics of such a deception, even as she wondered why she was seriously considering this bizarre proposal. Morgan nodded eagerly, relief flooding her features at Riley's matter-of-fact tone, as if having someone else acknowledge the plan out loud made it seem slightly less insane than it had felt in the isolation of her 3 a.m. desperation. "I can pay well," Morgan added quickly, naming a figure that made Riley's eyebrows rise slightly. It was more than she made in a week as a detective, and given her current financial situation, the offer was almost impossible to refuse. Riley's mind raced through the implications and her own reasons for needing the money, including the private investigator she had been paying out of pocket to follow leads on the Thompson case after the department had officially closed it and forbidden her from working it on company time. "Why me?" Riley asked, genuinely curious as she studied Morgan across the coffee shop table, trying to understand what had made this woman choose her response over the presumably numerous others she must have received from actual actors and performers. Morgan bit her lip, considering the question with an honesty that Riley found refreshing after years of dealing with people who lied as easily as breathing during police interviews and investigations. "Your email felt real," Morgan said finally, her dark eyes meeting Riley's with startling directness despite her obvious nervousness about the entire situation they were discussing. "Everyone else was performing, even in their messages, trying to sell me on why they'd be perfect for the role. But you just told me the truth, that you needed money and you could adapt to whatever I needed, and somehow that felt more trustworthy than all the perfectly crafted pitches from people with headshots and resumes." Riley felt something shift in her chest at those words, a recognition of kindred spirits perhaps, both of them operating slightly outside the normal boundaries of their lives, both of them carrying secrets and complications that made them willing to consider arrangements that other people would find questionable. She took a long drink of her coffee, buying herself a moment to think about whether she was really going to agree to this plan, knowing that she should probably walk away from this situation but finding herself drawn to Morgan's earnestness and desperation in ways that had nothing to do with the money being offered. They spent the next hour working out the details of their arrangement, Morgan pulling out her phone to show Riley pictures of her family members so she could recognize faces and names at the birthday party that was now just 3 weeks away. Riley studied the photos with the same attention to detail she brought to crime scene evidence, committing names and relationships to memory with the practiced ease of someone trained to absorb and recall vast amounts of information quickly and accurately under pressure. Morgan explained the fiction she had created about Sarah, that they had met at a mutual friend's dinner party, that Sarah worked in tech, that they had been together for 8 months and engaged for 3, details that Riley mentally cataloged and expanded upon with questions that helped make the backstory more robust and believable. "What does your family expect me to be like?" Riley asked, recognizing that understanding the audience's expectations was crucial to any successful undercover operation, even one as unconventional as pretending to be someone's fake fiancé at a family gathering. Morgan considered the question carefully, her expression softening as she thought about her grandmother and what the elderly woman hoped to see in her granddaughter's partner. "Kind," Morgan said quietly, "and obviously in love with me, which I know is a lot to ask someone to fake, but my grandmother is incredibly perceptive, even though she's sick, and she'll be watching how we are together to make sure I'm happy and that this is real." Riley felt a small warning bell go off in her mind at Morgan's words about needing to appear obviously in love, recognizing the potential complication of intimate deception even as she found herself agreeing to take on the role with a confidence born of years pretending to be someone else during undercover operations. She had gone undercover before as part of investigations, slipped into different personas and maintained them for weeks or even months, but something about this felt different, more personal, more dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with criminals or physical threats, and everything to do with a vulnerable woman sitting across from her, laying bare her desperate need for help. "I can do that," Riley heard herself say, watching relief and something else, maybe hope, flood across Morgan's expressive face in waves that made Riley's chest tighten unexpectedly. They exchanged real names and contact information, moving past the anonymous email addresses they had been using, and Riley learned that Morgan worked as a marketing consultant for nonprofit organizations, a career choice that somehow fit perfectly with the earnest, slightly awkward woman who had hired a stranger off the internet to solve her family drama. Morgan learned that Riley's initials stood for Riley Hayes, that she worked in security consulting, a vague truth that covered her actual job without revealing she was a detective, and that she had flexibility in her schedule to prepare for and attend the birthday party in 3 weeks' time. As they prepared to leave the coffee shop, Morgan impulsively reached out and touched Riley's arm, the contact brief but electric, sending an unexpected jolt through both of them that neither woman acknowledged aloud but both definitely felt. "Thank you," Morgan said softly, her eyes shining with gratitude and unshed tears that she was clearly fighting to keep under control in this public space, surrounded by other coffee shop patrons who had no idea they were witnessing the beginning of an elaborate deception. "You have no idea how much this means to me, how scared I've been about disappointing my grandmother, or having to confess that I've been lying to everyone for months about the most important relationship in my life." Riley nodded, understanding that weight of secrets and lies more than Morgan could possibly know, carrying her own burden of obsession with a case she couldn't solve and a victim she couldn't save no matter how many hours she poured into the investigation. They parted ways on the sidewalk outside, Morgan heading toward the bus stop and Riley walking to where she had parked her sedan 3 blocks away, both of them already second-guessing their agreement, but neither willing to back out now that the plan had been set in motion. Riley sat in her car for a long moment before starting the engine, Morgan's face lingering in her mind alongside the crime scene photos and evidence files that usually occupied all her thoughts, and she wondered what she had just gotten herself into with this beautiful, desperate woman who needed her to be someone she wasn't. The next morning, Riley met with Marcus Webb at their usual diner near the waterfront, the same greasy spoon where they had spent countless hours during the Thompson investigation, piecing together timelines and theories over bottomless coffee and stale donuts. Marcus looked different now, more polished, more official in his FBI windbreaker, the stress lines around his eyes slightly softer now that he wasn't obsessively working a case that seemed designed to destroy everyone who touched it. "You look like hell," Marcus observed as Riley slid into the booth across from him, and she couldn't really argue with his assessment given that she had spent most of the previous night lying awake thinking about both the Thompson case and the inexplicable arrangement she had just made with Morgan Chen. Marcus pushed a manila folder across the table, his expression grave in a way that made Riley's pulse quicken with anticipation and dread in equal measure. "I wasn't supposed to share this with you," he said quietly, glancing around to make sure no other patrons were within earshot of their conversation. "But you deserve to know. There's been another disappearance, same MO as Jennifer Thompson, and the brass are finally admitting we might have a pattern on our hands after all these years." Riley's hands shook slightly as she opened the folder, her trained eyes immediately scanning the case summary and crime scene photos of a woman who had vanished 2 weeks ago from a corporate fundraiser downtown, leaving behind her belongings and simply evaporating into the night exactly like Jennifer Thompson had 3 years earlier. The victim's name was Amanda Chen, a software engineer at a major tech company, last seen laughing with colleagues near the bar before security footage showed her walking toward the bathroom and never emerging, as if she had been erased from existence in the space between camera angles. Chen, Riley said aloud, the surname triggering something in her memory before she could quite place it, a nagging sense of connection that felt just out of reach like so many aspects of this frustrating case. Marcus nodded grimly, pulling out additional photos that showed Amanda Chen was Chinese-American, in her early 30s, successful in her career, and bore a striking resemblance to Jennifer Thompson in terms of physical appearance and demographic profile. The FBI is officially taking over both cases, Marcus continued, his voice low and intense with the familiar passion that had driven both of them to near breakdowns during the original investigation. They think we have a serial abductor targeting successful Asian American women at charity events and fundraisers, someone who knows how to exploit security gaps and blind spots in ways that suggest either inside knowledge or significant planning. Riley's mind raced as she studied the files, her detective instincts firing on all cylinders as patterns and connections started forming in ways they hadn't when Jennifer Thompson's disappearance had seemed like an isolated incident rather than part of a larger predatory pattern. What do we know about the fundraiser where Amanda Chen disappeared? Riley asked, already mentally comparing it to the charity gala where Jennifer had vanished, looking for overlapping elements that might point toward a suspect or common denominator. Marcus pulled out his phone and started scrolling through notes, his FBI training evident in the meticulous organization of information he had compiled about the recent case. It was a tech industry fundraiser for children's hospitals, about 300 attendees, mostly professionals from Seattle's tech sector, held at the same hotel that hosted Jennifer Thompson's charity gala 3 years ago, he explained, and Riley felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came when a case started yielding actual leads instead of dead ends. The hotel connection was significant, same venue, same general event type, same victim profile disappearing in the same inexplicable way, suggesting someone with access to the building or deep familiarity with its layout and security systems. Riley was already making mental notes about what she needed to investigate, old habits and obsessions reasserting themselves despite her captain's explicit orders to stay away from the Thompson case and focus on her assigned workload. There's something else, Marcus said, his expression troubled as he pulled out another document from the folder, this one showing financial records and background checks that the FBI had conducted on potential persons of interest. We found a connection between both victims. They were both members of the same online community for Asian American professionals in Seattle, a networking group that hosts regular meetups and events around the city. Riley felt her breath catch as she processed this new information, understanding immediately how significant this connection could be in terms of narrowing down potential suspects who might have access to both victims' schedules and habits. The networking group would provide a perfect hunting ground for a predator looking to identify and stalk potential victims, offering seemingly innocent social events where trust was assumed and guardrails were lowered in the name of professional connection and community building. Marcus watched her process the information, seeing the gears turning behind her eyes in the way only a former partner who had spent years working cases alongside her could recognize and interpret. Riley, he said carefully, his tone carrying a warning she knew she should heed but probably wouldn't. The FBI is handling this now, and your captain made it clear you're not supposed to be anywhere near the Thompson investigation, which means you definitely can't be involved in the Amanda Chen case either, no matter how badly you want to be. Riley knew Marcus was right, knew that pursuing this case could cost her the detective's badge she had worked so hard to earn and the career that defined so much of her identity and purpose in life. But she also knew that she couldn't just walk away from Jennifer Thompson and Amanda Chen, couldn't abandon two women who had been stolen from their lives by someone who was still out there, still hunting, still destroying families and futures with each carefully planned abduction. I hear you, Riley said noncommittally, which both she and Marcus understood meant she had no intention of staying away from the investigation despite the explicit orders and potential consequences. Marcus sighed but didn't argue further, knowing from years of partnership that Riley Hayes was going to do what she thought was right regardless of the rules or risks involved in her pursuit of justice. They spent another hour going over the case files, Marcus sharing everything the FBI had discovered so far, and Riley committing every detail to memory with a photographic recall that made her such an effective investigator when she wasn't letting her obsessions cloud her judgment. As they parted ways in the diner parking lot, Marcus gripped Riley's shoulder and said, "Be careful, Hayes. This guy has been getting away with this for at least 3 years, which means he's smart, careful, and absolutely ruthless in his planning and execution." Riley spent the rest of the day at the Seattle Public Library, using their computers and internet access to research the Asian American Professionals networking group that connected both victims, creating a timeline of events and membership rosters that might reveal overlapping attendees who could be potential suspects. She worked with a focused intensity that had earned her both commendations and reprimands throughout her career, losing track of time as she cross-referenced social media posts, event photos, and public records looking for patterns and connections that might have been missed during the initial investigations. It was nearly 7 in the evening when her phone buzzed with a text message from Morgan Chen. "Would you want to meet this week to practice? I know it sounds silly, but I think we should get comfortable with each other before the party, so it doesn't feel so awkward and fake." Riley stared at the message, the name, Chen, suddenly clicking into place in her mind with the force of a physical blow as she realized the potential connection she had been trying to identify all day. Morgan Chen, same last name as the most recent victim, Amanda Chen, both Chinese-American women in their early 30s working in Seattle's professional sectors, both potentially members of the same networking community that had connected Jennifer Thompson and Amanda Chen. Riley's investigative instincts went into overdrive as she considered the implications, wondering if she had just stumbled into the orbit of the very case she had been obsessing over for 3 years, or if this was just an unfortunate coincidence that her pattern-seeking detective brain was trying to force into significance. Riley texted back quickly, "Yes, let's meet. Tomorrow night? My place or yours?" She needed to see Morgan again, needed to ask careful questions, and assess whether there was any real connection to the case or if she was just seeing patterns where none existed, because this investigation had consumed her life so completely that she couldn't separate professional paranoia from genuine investigative leads. Morgan responded almost immediately with her address and a suggestion to meet at her apartment the following evening so they could practice being a couple, without the public awkwardness of trying to be affectionate in restaurants or coffee shops where people they knew might see them. Riley agreed, already planning what she would say and how she would subtly investigate whether Morgan had any connection to the missing women without revealing her own role as a detective or the real reason behind her interest in the case. She packed up her research materials and left the library as the last of the daylight faded from the Seattle sky, her mind churning with a collision of 2 seemingly separate aspects of her life: the fake engagement arrangement with Morgan and the serial abduction case that refused to let her go. Riley had always been good at compartmentalizing, at keeping different parts of her life separate and organized, but she could feel those carefully maintained boundaries beginning to blur and collapse as Morgan Chen became both a client she needed to help and a potential connection to the case that defined her entire career and consumed her every waking thought. Morgan spent the entire day before Riley's visit cleaning her apartment with a nervous energy that had nothing to do with tidiness and everything to do with the unexpected attraction she felt toward the woman who was supposed to be just a paid actress in her elaborate family deception. She vacuumed corners that didn't need vacuuming, reorganized bookshelves that were already perfectly organized, and changed her outfit 3 times before settling on casual jeans and a soft sweater that she hoped struck the right balance between approachable and attractive without looking like she was trying too hard. Morgan caught herself checking her reflection in every mirror and window, annoyed at how much she cared about Riley's impression of her apartment and appearance when this was supposed to be a strictly professional arrangement, focused on preparing for the family performance they would need to deliver in less than 3 weeks. She had ordered Thai food for dinner, remembering that Riley had mentioned liking spicy food during their coffee shop conversation, and now she stood in her kitchen second-guessing every decision as the delivery time approached, and her doorbell would soon announce Riley's arrival. Morgan took a deep breath and reminded herself that this was just a business transaction, that Riley was being paid to pretend to love her for a few hours at a family party, and that the flutter in her stomach every time she thought about seeing Riley again was just anxiety about the deception and not attraction to a woman she barely knew. Riley arrived at Morgan's apartment precisely on time, carrying a bottle of wine, and her detective's instincts humming with a need to observe and catalog every detail of Morgan's living space for clues about her potential connection to the missing women. The apartment was small but tastefully decorated, filled with books and plants and photographs that spoke of someone who valued relationships and memories, someone who seemed genuinely kind and normal and completely unlike the kind of person who would be involved in anything sinister or criminal. Morgan answered the door looking flushed and beautiful in a way that made Riley's carefully maintained professional detachment waver slightly, and she had to remind herself that she was here partly to investigate whether Morgan had any connection to Amanda Chen and the serial abduction case that consumed her life. "Thank you for coming," Morgan said, accepting the wine with a smile that transformed her already attractive features into something luminous and disarming in ways that Riley recognized as dangerous to her emotional equilibrium. They settled in Morgan's living room with glasses of wine and plates of Thai food, the initial awkwardness fading as they began discussing their cover story and how they would need to interact at the family party to convince everyone that their relationship was real and loving. Riley found herself relaxing despite her investigative agenda, drawn in by Morgan's earnest nervousness and self-deprecating humor about the ridiculous situation she had created for herself through months of compounding lies to her family. "Tell me about your family," Riley said, steering the conversation toward information gathering while making it seem like natural curiosity about the people she would need to convince during their performance. Morgan's expression softened as she talked about her grandmother, Helen Chen, who had emigrated from Taiwan as a young woman and built a successful life in Seattle through determination and sacrifice that defined the immigrant experience in America. Riley listened carefully, noting that Morgan's grandmother had been a prominent figure in Seattle's Asian American community for decades, serving on boards and organizing cultural events and networking opportunities for young professionals, exactly the kind of community organizing that connected Jennifer Thompson and Amanda Chen to each other and potentially to their abductor. "My grandmother started the Asian American Professionals Network back in the 90s, Morgan explained with obvious pride in her voice and eyes that shone with love for the elderly woman whose approval meant so much. She wanted to create opportunities for people like us to connect and support each other in industries where we were often isolated or overlooked because of our ethnicity and the challenges we faced in predominantly white professional spaces." Riley felt her stomach drop as Morgan confirmed what she had suspected, that Morgan's grandmother had literally founded the organization that connected both missing women, making Morgan's family central to the network that the abductor had been using as a hunting ground for at least 3 years. Riley forced herself to maintain a neutral expression as her mind raced through the implications of this new information, trying to determine whether Morgan herself was in danger or whether her connection to the victims was purely coincidental and circumstantial. "Are you a member of the network?" Riley asked casually, taking a sip of wine to mask the intensity of her interest in Morgan's answer to this crucial question. Morgan shook her head, a slight frown crossing her features as she explained, "I went to a few events when I first moved back to Seattle after college, but I never really connected with the networking scene. Too much small talk and business card exchanges for my taste, and I always felt like I was performing a version of success I hadn't achieved yet." Riley felt a mixture of relief and concern at this information. Relief that Morgan wasn't actively involved in the network where 2 women had been targeted and abducted, but concern that her absence from recent events didn't necessarily mean she was safe from whatever predator had been stalking successful Asian American women through that community. "What about your cousin Amanda?" Riley asked, throwing out the name like a casual question but watching Morgan's reaction carefully for any sign of recognition or alarm. Morgan's confusion was immediate and genuine as she said, "I don't have a cousin named Amanda. Are you thinking of someone else in my family?" Riley backtracked smoothly, pretending she had misremembered a name from the family photos Morgan had shown her during their coffee shop meeting, but internally her investigator's mind was analyzing Morgan's response and body language for any signs of deception or knowledge about Amanda Chen's disappearance. Morgan seemed completely unaware of the recent abduction, which made sense if she wasn't actively involved in the Asian American professional community and if the story hadn't received widespread media coverage beyond the immediate circles affected by the disappearance. Riley made a mental note to check whether Morgan and Amanda Chen were actually related. Chen was a common surname, but in Seattle's relatively small Asian American professional network, there could be family connections that Morgan wasn't aware of or that extended through marriages and distant relations she hadn't kept track of over the years. They moved on to practicing their cover story, with Morgan explaining how she had described their fictional relationship to her family and Riley asking questions to make their backstory more detailed and believable for the scrutiny they would face from Morgan's perceptive grandmother. "We should probably practice being physically affectionate," Morgan said, her cheeks flushing pink as she broached the awkward topic they had both been avoiding since Riley arrived at the apartment. "My grandmother will expect us to be comfortable touching each other, holding hands, maybe sitting close together, and if we're stiff and awkward about it, she'll know something is wrong no matter how well we stick to our story." Riley agreed, recognizing the practical necessity of rehearsing physical intimacy even as she felt her own pulse quicken at the prospect of touching Morgan in ways that would require crossing professional boundaries and engaging emotions she usually kept locked down tight. They started simply, sitting close on the couch with their shoulders touching, then progressed to holding hands, their fingers intertwining in a way that felt both natural and electrically charged with an attraction neither of them was quite ready to acknowledge aloud. Morgan's hand was warm and slightly trembling in Riley's grip, and Riley found herself rubbing her thumb across Morgan's knuckles in a soothing gesture that came from genuine instinct rather than practiced performance. "Tell me something real about yourself," Morgan said quietly, her dark eyes searching Riley's face with an intensity that made Riley feel exposed and vulnerable in ways that had nothing to do with her undercover detective work. Riley hesitated, torn between her need to maintain the barrier between her real life and this fake relationship arrangement, and an unexpected desire to be honest with this woman who had trusted her with something so personal and important despite barely knowing her. "I have a younger sister I haven't spoken to in 2 years because I missed her wedding while I was working a case," Riley heard herself confess, the words emerging before she could stop them, revealing more vulnerability than she had shown anyone in years of carefully guarded emotional isolation. Morgan squeezed Riley's hand in response, her expression full of understanding and compassion that made Riley's chest ache with feelings she couldn't quite name or categorize within her usual emotional framework. "What was the case?" Morgan asked gently, giving Riley space to share or deflect as she chose, and Riley found herself wanting to tell Morgan everything about Jennifer Thompson, about the obsession that had cost her a relationship and nearly her career, about the new disappearance that suggested a serial predator was still out there hunting women who looked like Morgan herself. But she couldn't reveal the case without revealing her identity as a detective, and she couldn't do that without potentially destroying the fragile trust they were building and losing the access to Morgan's family and the networking community that might hold crucial information about the abductor she had been hunting for 3 years. "Just a missing person case that went cold," Riley said vaguely, technically truthful but deliberately incomplete, and she hated the way she was lying to Morgan even as she told herself it was necessary for the investigation and for Morgan's own protection. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, still holding hands on Morgan's couch, and Riley realized with a mixture of wonder and dread that this fake relationship was starting to feel dangerously real in ways that could complicate everything: her investigation, her professional boundaries, her carefully maintained emotional walls, and most importantly, her ability to protect Morgan from dangers the other woman didn't even know existed in the shadows of her grandmother's beloved professional network. Over the next 2 weeks, Riley and Morgan met 4 more times to practice their roles and build the comfortable intimacy that would sell their relationship to Morgan's perceptive family members at the upcoming birthday celebration. Each meeting deepened the connection between them in ways that transcended their original transactional arrangement, conversations flowing easily from rehearsed backstories to genuine revelations about their lives, dreams, fears, and the loneliness that had brought them both to that coffee shop on a rainy morning seeking something they couldn't quite name. Riley found herself looking forward to these evenings with Morgan with an anticipation that had nothing to do with her investigation and everything to do with the way Morgan's laugh made her feel lighter, the way Morgan listened with complete attention when Riley talked, the way their hands found each other naturally now without the awkwardness of their first attempts at physical affection. Between meetings with Morgan, Riley continued her unauthorized investigation into the serial abductions, cross-referencing attendee lists from networking events with both victims' social media connections and building a profile of potential suspects who had access to both women and detailed knowledge of the venues where they disappeared. She was walking a dangerous line between her professional obligations and her personal obsessions, spending her official work hours on assigned cases while devoting every spare moment to the Thompson investigation that her captain had explicitly forbidden her from pursuing any further. Marcus called her 3 days before Morgan's grandmother's birthday party with news that made Riley's blood run cold despite the warm spring sunshine streaming through her apartment windows. "We found Jennifer Thompson's body," he said without preamble, his voice heavy with the weight of delivering news that every missing person detective dreads having to share with families still holding on to hope. Riley sank onto her couch, the air rushing from her lungs as 3 years of desperate searching finally reached its terrible conclusion in a shallow grave discovered by hikers in the Cascade foothills north of Seattle. "How long?" Riley managed to ask, her detective brain automatically seeking the clinical details that would help her process the emotional devastation of losing a victim she had fought so hard to save. Marcus explained that the medical examiner estimated Jennifer had been dead for approximately 2.5 years, which meant she had survived for roughly 6 months after her abduction before her killer had finally ended her life and discarded her body in the wilderness like garbage. The cause of death was still being determined, but preliminary examination suggested she had been held captive for an extended period, subjected to conditions and treatment that Riley's imagination filled in with horrors she had seen in too many other cases involving predators who kept their victims alive for their own twisted purposes before eventually murdering them. "Amanda Chen is still out there," Marcus continued, and Riley heard the urgency beneath his professional tone, the implicit plea for Riley to help find Amanda before she met the same fate as Jennifer Thompson in some isolated location where her body might not be discovered for years. Riley's mind immediately jumped to Morgan, to the grandmother who had founded the network that connected all these women, to the birthday party in 3 days where Seattle's Asian American professional community would gather to celebrate Helen Chen's life and legacy. "Marcus, I need you to run a background check on someone for me," Riley said, making a decision that could cost her everything but that she couldn't avoid making given what was at stake. She gave him Morgan's full name and birth date, explaining in vague terms that she had encountered Morgan through unrelated circumstances and needed to verify whether there was any familial connection to Amanda Chen or any reason to believe Morgan herself might be at risk from the predator who had killed Jennifer and still held Amanda captive somewhere. Marcus agreed to run the check quietly, understanding without Riley having to spell it out that she was operating outside official channels and needed information without leaving a trail that would alert their superiors to her continued involvement in the forbidden investigation. They hung up with Marcus promising to call back within hours with whatever information he could find, and Riley sat in her apartment feeling the weight of responsibility pressing down on her shoulders like physical force she could barely withstand. Riley's phone buzzed with a text from Morgan. "Can you come over tonight? I'm nervous about the party and could use some company." The message was accompanied by a photo of Morgan's cat, a gray tabby named Miso, who had become a recurring character in their conversations and a source of lighthearted humor during their practice sessions at Morgan's apartment. Riley stared at the photo, seeing not just Morgan's cat but all the normal, innocent details of Morgan's life that could be shattered if Riley's worst fears about her proximity to the serial abduction case proved accurate and well-founded. She texted back immediately, "I'll be there in 30 minutes, then spent those 30 minutes conducting her own quick research into Helen Chen's background and history with the Asian American Professionals Network she had founded decades ago. What Riley discovered made the connections even more alarming. Helen Chen had been a prominent advocate for young Asian American women in business, serving as a mentor to hundreds of professionals over the years, including both Jennifer Thompson and Amanda Chen, according to archived newsletters and event photos Riley found in the organization's digital archives. Helen had personally recruited both women to join the network, had written recommendation letters for their career advancements, and had featured them in promotional materials about the organization's success stories of members who had achieved significant professional accomplishments through the community and support structure Helen had worked so hard to build over her lifetime. Riley arrived at Morgan's apartment with her mind churning through possibilities and scenarios, trying to determine how much she should reveal about the danger that might be circling Morgan's family, without breaking her cover or causing panic that might not be warranted if her investigative instincts were leading her toward connections that didn't actually exist. Morgan answered the door in sweatpants and an oversized university t-shirt, her hair pulled back in a messy bun, looking vulnerable and young, and nothing like the polished professional Riley had first met in the coffee shop 3 weeks ago. "Sorry, I'm a mess," Morgan said, laughing self-consciously as she gestured Riley inside to the now familiar living room where they had spent so many evenings building their fake relationship into something that felt increasingly real and complicated. "I've been calling relatives all day confirming attendance for the party, and my mother keeps texting me questions about Sarah that I have to answer carefully so I don't contradict anything I've already told different family members over the past 6 months of maintaining this lie." Riley pulled Morgan into a hug without thinking, a gesture of comfort that came from genuine caring rather than their practiced performance of affection, and she felt Morgan relax into her embrace with a sigh that spoke of exhaustion and stress and relief at having someone to lean on even temporarily. They stood in Morgan's entryway for a long moment, holding each other in silence, and Riley realized with startling clarity that she was falling for this woman she was supposed to be pretending to love, that somewhere in the past 3 weeks the line between performance and reality had blurred beyond recognition or recovery. "Morgan, I need to ask you something," Riley said carefully as they settled on the couch with the tea Morgan had prepared while Riley played with miso to buy herself time to formulate her questions. "Your grandmother's network. Do you know if there have been any problems recently, anyone who made the members uncomfortable, any incidents that stood out as concerning or inappropriate?" Morgan looked confused by the question but considered it seriously, her brow furrowing as she thought back through conversations with her grandmother and other family members involved in the organization's management and operations. "Not that I know of," Morgan said slowly, "but I'm pretty removed from the day-to-day operations since I don't attend events anymore, so there could be things I wouldn't hear about unless they were serious enough for my grandmother to mention during our weekly phone calls." Riley pressed gently, asking whether Morgan's grandmother had mentioned any members going missing or any police involvement with the network in recent years, watching Morgan's face carefully for any flicker of recognition or knowledge about the disappearances that had consumed Riley's life for so long. Morgan shook her head, clearly puzzled by Riley's line of questioning but trusting enough not to question Riley's motivations for asking such strange and specific questions about her grandmother's organization. "Why are you asking about this?" Morgan finally said, her dark eyes searching Riley's face with growing concern and confusion about where this conversation was heading. Riley made a split-second decision to tell Morgan a version of the truth, not revealing her identity as a detective but sharing enough information to potentially protect Morgan without completely destroying the trust they had built over their weeks of growing intimacy and connection. "I heard something on the news about a woman who went missing from a professional networking event recently," Riley said carefully, keeping her voice neutral and her explanation vague enough to maintain plausible deniability. "It made me think about the party this weekend and whether we should be aware of any safety concerns given that your grandmother's network is bringing together so many people in one place." Morgan's expression shifted from confusion to alarm as she processed Riley's words, her hand instinctively reaching for Riley's in a gesture that had become natural between them over their weeks of practiced and genuine affection. "You think something could happen at my grandmother's party?" Morgan asked, her voice rising slightly with anxiety that Riley immediately wanted to soothe even as she knew she had introduced this fear for Morgan's own protection and safety. Riley squeezed Morgan's hand reassuringly, explaining that she was probably being overly cautious, but that it never hurt to be aware of surroundings and to stay in groups at large events where lots of people were coming and going in ways that could provide cover for someone with bad intentions. Morgan nodded slowly, clearly trying to process this new dimension of concern about an event she had already been anxious about for entirely different reasons related to maintaining their elaborate deception in front of her perceptive and loving family members. Marcus called back at midnight with information that confirmed Riley's worst fears and added layers of complexity she hadn't anticipated to the web of connections surrounding Morgan's family and the serial abduction case. Morgan Chen is Amanda Chen's second cousin, Marcus reported, his voice tight with the professional concern of an agent who understood exactly what this familial connection meant in terms of risk assessment and potential targeting by a predator who had already killed one woman and held another captive. They're not close, apparently haven't seen each other since they were teenagers at family gatherings, but they're definitely related through Helen Chen's extended family network. Riley's heart hammered in her chest as she processed this confirmation, understanding that Morgan wasn't just tangentially connected to the case through her grandmother's organization but was actually family to one of the victims, making her a potential target if the abductor was working through some twisted logic about Helen Chen's family and Metz. Marcus continued with more alarming information. The FBI profiler thinks our unsub might be targeting women connected to Helen Chen specifically, either as revenge for some perceived wrong or as part of an obsession with Helen herself or what she represents in the Asian American professional community. Riley felt sick as she imagined Morgan disappearing the same way Jennifer and Amanda had, vanishing from a crowded event and ending up in a shallow grave or worse, held captive by someone acting out fantasies that Riley's years on the force had taught her could be more horrific than most people's nightmares could conjure. The party this weekend, Riley said urgently, her detective instincts overriding her personal involvement as she focused on the tactical realities of protecting potential targets at a large gathering. It's Helen Chen's 80th birthday celebration, and from what Morgan has told me, basically everyone from the Asian American Professionals Network will be there, including board members, longtime members, and successful professionals that Helen has mentored over the years. Marcus swore softly on the other end of the line, immediately grasping the implications of having so many potential targets gathered in one location that the abductor might already have marked on his calendar as an opportunity too perfect to pass up. We need to have FBI presence at that party, Marcus said firmly, already shifting into operational planning mode that Riley recognized from their years of partnership. But we can't go in heavy-handed and panic everyone or tip off the unsub if he's planning something. We need to be subtle, blend in with the guests, and watch for anyone who seems out of place or overly interested in specific attendees. Riley's mind raced through the logistics, recognizing that her own presence at the party as Morgan's fake fiancé actually provided perfect cover for surveillance while also fulfilling her commitment to help Morgan maintain her deception in front of her family. I'll be there anyway, Riley admitted, deciding to trust Marcus with the truth about her arrangement with Morgan despite how unprofessional and potentially compromising it would appear to outside observers. Riley explained the whole situation to Marcus, the fake engagement, her agreement to pretend to be Morgan's fiancé, the money she was being paid, the way her personal involvement had become hopelessly entangled with her professional interest in the case that had consumed her life for 3 years. Marcus listened without judgment, his silence on the other end of the line more thoughtful than condemning as he processed the complicated web Riley had woven between her investigation and her growing feelings for a woman who might be in serious danger from the predator they were hunting. "This is a mess, Hayes," Marcus finally said, but his tone was almost admiring of the way Riley had accidentally positioned herself at the center of everything they needed to surveil and protect. "But it also gives us an advantage. You'll have legitimate access to the party, to Helen Chen's inner circle, to conversations and observations that we couldn't get any other way without revealing the investigation and potentially spooking our unsub." They spent the next hour coordinating strategy, with Marcus agreeing to have undercover FBI agents positioned throughout the party venue as catering staff and security personnel, while Riley would maintain her cover as Morgan's fiancé and watch for suspicious behavior from the inside. Riley felt the familiar rush of an operation coming together, But underneath the professional satisfaction was a deep current of fear for Morgan's safety and guilt about the deception she was maintaining, even as she told herself it was necessary to protect Morgan from dangers the other woman still didn't fully understand or believe were real. The day of Helen Chen's birthday party arrived with unseasonably warm weather and clear blue skies that seemed cruelly at odds with the dark purpose that had brought Riley to the elegant hotel ballroom where Morgan's extended family had gathered to celebrate. Riley wore a navy blue dress that Morgan had helped her pick out during a shopping trip that had felt more like a real date than a preparation for their fake relationship performance, and she watched Morgan move through the crowd greeting relatives with genuine affection and obvious nervousness about maintaining their deception. Morgan looked beautiful in an emerald green dress that brought out the warmth in her dark eyes, and Riley felt her heart clench with the realization that she would do anything to protect this woman who had somehow become so important to her in such a short time. Helen Chen held court at the center of the ballroom, a tiny woman with silver hair and bright, intelligent eyes that Riley recognized immediately as the source of Morgan's perceptive nature and sharp observation skills. The elderly woman was clearly beloved by everyone in attendance, surrounded by family members and professional colleagues who had traveled from across the country to celebrate her 80th birthday and honor her decades of service to the Asian American community. Riley scanned the crowd with practiced casualness, noting the FBI agents she recognized positioned strategically throughout the room, all of them watching for the threat they hoped wouldn't materialize but needed to be prepared to intercept if it did. Morgan brought Riley over to meet her grandmother, and Riley felt the full force of Helen Chen's attention focus on her with an intensity that made her understand why this woman had been such an effective mentor and leader for so many years. "So you're Sarah," Helen said in lightly accented English, her hand surprisingly strong as she gripped Riley's in greeting. "My granddaughter has told me so much about you, and I'm glad to finally meet the woman who has made Morgan so happy these past months." Riley felt the weight of deception pressing on her conscience as she looked into Helen's kind eyes and saw genuine joy there, happiness that her granddaughter had found love and partnership with another woman in a world that hadn't always been accepting of such relationships. "It's an honor to meet you, Mrs. Chen," Riley said honestly, meaning every word even as she maintained the fiction of her identity and relationship with Morgan. They talked for several minutes, Helen asking Riley questions about her background and career with the sharp attention of someone who had spent decades assessing people's character and potential. Riley answered carefully, sticking to the cover story she and Morgan had constructed but finding herself sharing genuine feelings about her admiration for Morgan and the happiness their time together had brought to her life. Words that were true even if the context surrounding them was built on elaborate lies and professional necessity. As the party progressed, Riley noticed a man lingering at the edges of the celebration, someone who seemed out of place among the predominantly Asian American guests and the tight-knit community that had gathered to honor Helen Chen. He was white, middle-aged, dressed in a server's uniform but not actually serving anything, his attention fixed on specific women in the crowd with an intensity that made Riley's detective instincts flare with alarm and recognition. She caught Marcus's eye across the room and saw that he had also noticed the man, both of them moving subtly to position themselves for better observation without revealing their law enforcement interest or spooking their potential suspect. Riley kept one hand on Morgan's lower back, a possessive gesture that was partly performance for Morgan's family and partly genuine protective instinct as she tracked the suspicious man's movement through the ballroom. The man seemed particularly interested in Helen Chen and the women closest to her, board members of the professional network, successful professionals who fit the same demographic profile as Jennifer Thompson and Amanda Chen, women who represented everything Helen had worked to nurture and promote throughout her decades of community leadership and mentorship. Riley felt her pulse quicken as years of investigation suddenly crystallized into a moment of recognition. This was their unsub, she was certain of it, and he was here hunting new victims at the very event meant to celebrate Helen Chen's legacy of empowering and protecting the women he had been targeting and destroying. Riley leaned close to Morgan, maintaining the appearance of an intimate moment between partners while urgently whispering, "Don't react, but I need you to stay close to me and your family for the rest of the evening." Morgan stiffened slightly in confusion but trusted Riley enough to nod without demanding explanations in this crowded public space, surrounded by relatives who were watching their every interaction for signs of the genuine love they were supposed to be displaying. Riley texted Marcus quickly under the cover of checking her phone, alerting him to her suspicions about the man in the server's uniform and coordinating their next moves without revealing their law enforcement presence to the hundreds of innocent guests who had gathered for what should have been a joyous celebration. The man was moving toward the hallway that led to the hotel's service areas and back exits, the same type of location where Amanda Chen had disappeared from the security camera footage during her abduction 2 months ago. Riley faced an impossible choice: maintain her cover and stay with Morgan to protect her, or break away and pursue the suspect who might be their only chance to find Amanda Chen alive and bring justice for Jennifer Thompson after 3 years of obsessive investigation. She looked at Morgan's trusting face, felt the warmth of Morgan's hand in hers, and realized that her decision had already been made the moment she had started caring about this woman more than she cared about the case that had defined her entire career and consumed every aspect of her personal life for years. Riley made her decision in a heartbeat, pulling Morgan close and speaking directly into her ear with urgent intensity that cut through the ambient party noise and music. "Morgan, I need you to listen to me very carefully. I'm not who you think I am, and there's no time to explain everything, but you need to trust me right now." Morgan pulled back slightly, confusion and hurt flashing across her features as she processed Riley's words and the implications of deception they carried with them. "I'm a detective with the Seattle Police Department," Riley continued quickly, watching Morgan's expression shift from hurt to shock to dawning understanding. "There's a man here who we believe has abducted and killed women from your grandmother's network, and I think he's about to make another move tonight, possibly targeting someone in your family." Morgan's face went pale as the reality of what Riley was saying crashed over her like a physical wave, all the small strange questions and behaviors from their weeks together suddenly making terrible sense in light of this revelation. Riley hated herself for the betrayal she saw in Morgan's eyes, hated that their relationship had been built on lies even if some of the feelings had become desperately real, but there was no time for apologies or explanations when lives were at stake and a predator was moving through the crowd with murderous intent. "I need you to go to your grandmother right now and stay with her and your parents," Riley instructed, her voice carrying the authoritative tone of a cop giving orders during an active threat situation. "Don't leave the main ballroom. Don't go anywhere alone. And if anyone tries to get you to follow them somewhere private, scream and make a scene." Morgan nodded numbly, still processing the cascade of revelations that had just shattered her understanding of Riley and their entire relationship in the space of 30 seconds. Riley saw Marcus across the room gesturing urgently toward the service corridor where their suspect had disappeared, and she made a split-second tactical decision that went against every protective instinct screaming at her to stay with Morgan and guard her personally. "There are FBI agents throughout this room disguised as catering staff and security," Riley told Morgan quickly, pointing out Marcus and 2 other agents she recognized from previous joint operations. "If anything happens, go to them immediately and tell them Riley Hayes sent you." Then Riley was moving through the crowd toward the service corridor, her hand instinctively reaching for the weapon she wore in an ankle holster beneath her dress, adrenaline sharpening her senses as she transitioned from fake fiancé to detective hunting a predator who had evaded capture for 3 years. The service corridor was dimly lit and eerily quiet compared to the celebration happening just beyond the heavy doors that separated the public spaces from the hotel's working areas where staff moved supplies and conducted business invisible to guests. Riley moved cautiously, her weapon drawn, and held in a ready position as she cleared corners and checked doorways with the methodical precision of someone who had conducted countless building searches throughout her career. She could hear footsteps ahead of her, moving quickly but not running, the purposeful stride of someone who knew exactly where they were going and had been here before, which confirmed her theory that this predator had extensive familiarity with the hotel's layout from previous abductions. Riley keyed her radio, maintaining radio silence, but knowing that Marcus and the FBI team would be tracking her position through the GPS signal from her phone and coordinating their response to converge on her location. The corridor branched ahead, and Riley had to make a choice about which direction to pursue, left toward the loading docks and parking areas where a vehicle could be waiting, or right toward the stairwells that led to upper floors and rooms where someone could be held temporarily before being moved to a secondary location. She chose left based on the pattern from Amanda Chen's abduction, where witnesses had reported seeing a catering van leaving the loading area shortly after the victim's disappearance, a detail that had seemed insignificant at the time, but now felt crucial to understanding this predator's methodology. Riley burst through the loading dock doors into the warm evening air, her eyes immediately scanning the parking area for the suspect or any vehicles that looked out of place among the hotel's service vehicles and delivery trucks. She spotted movement near a white panel van at the far end of the lot, a figure loading something, or someone, into the back with urgent, furtive movements that triggered every alarm Riley's years of experience had honed to razor sharpness. "Police! Freeze!" Riley shouted, her weapon trained on the figure as she advanced across the parking lot with her heart hammering against her ribs. The man spun around, and Riley recognized him from the ballroom. Middle-aged, nondescript features, the kind of person who could blend into any crowd and be forgotten immediately, which was probably exactly how he had operated undetected for so long. But his eyes were wrong, filled with a cold calculation and rage that Riley had seen before in the worst predators she had encountered during her career, people who viewed other humans as objects to be used and discarded according to their twisted desires and fantasies. "Detective Riley Hayes," the man said calmly, which sent ice through Riley's veins because it meant he knew who she was, had probably been watching her investigation, might have even been playing games with her throughout the 3 years she had been hunting him. "I was wondering when you would figure it out. You've been so close so many times, but you kept missing the most obvious connection right in front of you." Riley maintained her tactical position, weapon steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system as she processed the implications of this predator knowing her name and having followed her investigation closely enough to track her near misses and mistakes. "Where is Amanda Chen?" Riley demanded, her voice hard and cold with the controlled fury of a detective who had spent 3 years watching this monster destroy families and lives. The man smiled, a chilling expression that held no warmth or humanity, just the satisfaction of someone who enjoyed the power he held over other people's suffering and fear. "She's alive for now," he said conversationally, as if discussing something mundane rather than a woman he had held captive for 2 months. "Just like Jennifer was alive for 6 months before I got bored with her. They're so much more interesting when they still have hope, when they still believe someone might find them and save them from what's happening." Riley felt rage threatening to override her training, the desire to simply shoot this monster where he stood almost overwhelming her commitment to procedure and justice that required taking him alive, so he could face trial and accountability. Behind her, she heard footsteps and knew Marcus and the FBI team had arrived to provide backup, their presence giving her the confidence to advance closer to the van where she could see a figure lying bound and unconscious in the back. Not Amanda Chen as she had expected, but another woman younger, who Riley recognized with horror from the party as one of Morgan's cousins who had been greeting guests near the entrance earlier in the evening. "Nobody else has to get hurt tonight," Riley said, shifting her approach to negotiation even as she calculated her shot placement and the risks of firing with an unconscious hostage so close to the suspect. "Let her go, and we can talk about this. You can tell me why you've been targeting these women, what Helen Chen did that made you so angry." The man's expression twisted with genuine emotion for the first time, a combination of obsession and resentment that gave Riley crucial insight into his motivations even as it made him more unpredictable and dangerous. "Helen Chen destroyed my family," he spat, his calm facade cracking to reveal the seething hatred beneath. "My wife, my beautiful, talented wife, killed herself after Helen convinced her to leave me, told her she deserved better than a supportive husband who sacrificed everything for her career, poisoned her mind with feminist nonsense about independence and empowerment until she couldn't see what we had together." Riley understood now, the twisted logic of a man who blamed Helen Chen's mentorship and community building for his own failures and losses, who had decided to punish Helen by systematically destroying the women she had helped and elevated through her decades of advocacy and support. He was taking revenge on Helen's legacy, one successful woman at a time, trying to prove that the independence and empowerment Helen promoted only led to suffering and death at the hands of someone who could strip it all away whenever he chose. Marcus and 3 FBI agents emerged from the loading dock doors with weapons drawn, surrounding the van and cutting off any escape routes the suspect might have been calculating in his mind. "It's over," Marcus called out with the authoritative calm of an experienced agent who had talked down countless dangerous situations. "We have the parking lot surrounded, and there's nowhere for you to go. Let the woman go and surrender peacefully." For a moment, Riley thought he might comply, might recognize that his reign of terror had finally reached its end, and that continued resistance would only result in his death or capture after a violent confrontation. But then she saw his hand move toward his pocket, saw the desperate calculation in his eyes of a cornered predator who would rather go down fighting than face accountability for his crimes. "Gun!" Riley shouted, her training overriding everything else as she fired twice, center mass, the shots echoing across the parking lot like thunderclaps that shattered the warm evening air. The man crumpled to the pavement, his weapon falling from nerveless fingers, and Riley was already moving forward to secure the scene and check on the unconscious woman in the van, even as her hands shook with the adrenaline crash that always followed officer-involved shootings. She had killed people before in the line of duty, had made that terrible choice when lives hung in the balance, but it never got easier, never felt like anything other than a necessary evil that would haunt her dreams alongside all the other ghosts her career had accumulated over the years of fighting monsters and trying to save their victims. The scene that followed was controlled chaos. Paramedics arrived to treat Morgan's cousin, who was drugged but alive and would recover physically from her ordeal, while crime scene technicians processed the van for evidence that might lead them to Amanda Chen's location. Riley gave her statement to the officer-involved shooting investigators, her voice mechanical and distant as she recounted the events that had led to her firing her weapon and taking a life in defense of an innocent victim. Marcus stood beside her throughout the process, his presence a silent support that Riley appreciated even as she felt the familiar numbness settling over her emotions, the protective dissociation that cops developed to function in the aftermath of traumatic incidents. The suspect's body had been pronounced dead at the scene, and Riley felt a grim satisfaction that he would never hurt anyone else, mixed with frustration that he had taken the location of Amanda Chen with him to his grave, unless they could find evidence in the van or his personal effects that would lead them to where he had been holding his captive. She wanted desperately to see Morgan, to explain everything and try to salvage something from the wreckage of their relationship, but she was confined to the investigation area, while the shooting was processed according to department protocol that existed to protect both officers and the public from potential misconduct or cover-ups. Inside the hotel ballroom, Morgan sat with her shaken family as her rescued cousin was taken away in an ambulance, and police officers tried to explain what had happened without revealing too much about the ongoing investigation into the serial abductions. Morgan's mind kept circling back to Riley, Sarah, except not Sarah, never Sarah, just Riley Hayes, who had been lying to her from the very beginning about who she was and why she had agreed to play the role of fake fiancée in Morgan's desperate family deception. Everything made sense now in retrospect. Riley's questions about the professional network, her interest in Helen's mentorship activities, the way she had seemed almost too perfect for the role Morgan needed her to fill, as if she had her own reasons for wanting access to the party and Morgan's family connections. Morgan felt betrayed and used, her genuine feelings for Riley now tainted by the knowledge that their entire relationship had been built on investigation and professional necessity rather than the authentic connection she had believed they were developing over their weeks together. But beneath the hurt and anger, Morgan also felt a confusing gratitude that Riley's deception had saved her cousin's life and potentially prevented more abductions from destroying more families in the Asian American community that Helen had worked so hard to build and protect. Morgan's grandmother sat beside her, holding her hand with surprising strength for someone so elderly and frail, and Morgan realized with a start that Helen didn't look shocked by any of the evening's revelations, as if she had suspected darker currents running beneath the surface of her birthday celebration all along. "You knew," Morgan said quietly to her grandmother, the pieces clicking together as she studied Helen's carefully neutral expression. "You knew that Sarah wasn't really my fiancée, and you knew something dangerous was happening with the network." Helen smiled sadly, squeezing Morgan's hand with the gentle affection of someone who had always seen more than people realized. "I suspected Sarah was not who you said she was," Helen admitted, her accented English soft but clear despite the chaos surrounding them. "But I also saw the way you looked at her and the way she looked at you, and I knew that whatever brought you together, the feelings between you were real, even if the circumstances were complicated and not entirely honest." Morgan felt tears burning in her eyes as she processed her grandmother's words, the validation that her feelings for Riley had been genuine, even if everything else about their relationship had been constructed on foundations of deception and professional investigation. "As for the danger," Helen continued, her expression growing darker with remembered pain, "I have known for some time that someone was targeting the women I mentor, and I've been working with the police to try to identify the person responsible before more lives were destroyed by his hatred and violence." Morgan stared at her grandmother in shock, realizing that Helen had been carrying this terrible knowledge and guilt while battling her own declining health, trying to protect her community while watching the women she had nurtured and elevated being systematically hunted by someone who blamed her for his own failures and losses. 3 hours later, Riley was finally cleared from the shooting investigation scene and allowed to return to the hotel, where she found Morgan sitting alone in a small conference room that the hotel management had provided for the family to gather and process the traumatic events. Morgan looked up as Riley entered, her expression guarded and hurt in ways that made Riley's chest ache with regret for all the deception and pain she had caused this woman who deserved so much better than the lies Riley had fed her. "I'm sorry," Riley said simply, knowing that no explanation or justification could erase the betrayal Morgan must be feeling after learning that their entire relationship had begun as part of Riley's investigation. "I know that doesn't mean much right now, and I know I should have told you the truth earlier, but I was trying to protect you and solve a case that has haunted me for 3 years, and I handled everything badly." Morgan studied Riley for a long moment, her dark eyes searching Riley's face for something, honesty, maybe, or genuine remorse beyond the professional apology of a cop who had compromised an investigation by developing feelings for someone connected to her case. "Did any of it mean anything to you?" Morgan asked quietly, her voice breaking slightly on the words. "Or was I just a convenient cover story that gave you access to the network and my grandmother's connections?" Paragraph 54. Riley crossed the room and knelt in front of Morgan's chair, taking Morgan's hands in hers with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with the violence she had enacted just hours earlier in the hotel parking lot. "Everything between us was real," Riley said with fierce intensity, needing Morgan to understand this truth even if she couldn't forgive the lies that had surrounded it. "I took the job because I needed the money and the access to your family's network for my investigation, but somewhere along the way, pretending to love you became the easiest thing I've ever done because I wasn't pretending anymore." Tears spilled down Morgan's cheeks as she processed Riley's confession, the genuine emotion in Riley's voice cutting through the hurt and betrayal to reach the part of Morgan that still cared deeply for this complicated, damaged woman who fought monsters and saved lives while carrying burdens that Morgan was only beginning to understand. "My cousin is alive because of you," Morgan said shakily, acknowledging the reality that Riley's deception had served a purpose beyond professional ambition or investigation, that Levs had been saved by Riley's willingness to lie and manipulate her way into Morgan's family gathering. "But I don't know how to reconcile the woman I fell for with the detective who used me to solve her case, and I don't know if I can trust anything between us after learning that our foundation was built entirely on lies and investigation rather than authentic connection." Riley nodded, accepting Morgan's hurt and confusion as entirely justified and deserved given the circumstances of their relationship and the revelations of the evening. "I understand if you never want to see me again," Riley said quietly, even though the thought of losing Morgan permanently felt like a physical wound in her chest. "But I need you to know that while the beginning was about the case, what I feel for you now is completely separate from any professional consideration or investigation." She stood to leave, respecting Morgan's need for space and time to process everything that had happened, but Morgan caught her hand and held it, not pulling Riley back, but not letting her go entirely either. "We still haven't found Amanda Chen," Morgan said, shifting the conversation away from their relationship to the more immediate crisis that still needed resolution. "My grandmother told me about your investigation and why you've been so obsessed with these cases. Is there anything I can do to help find Amanda before it's too late?" Riley felt a surge of gratitude for Morgan's generosity of spirit, her willingness to set aside personal hurt to focus on saving a woman who was still in danger somewhere, held captive by a now-dead abductor whose secrets had died with him. "The van is being processed for evidence," Riley explained, "and we're searching the suspect's home and known locations. But time is critical. If he had Amanda stashed somewhere without regular care, she might not survive much longer without intervention and rescue." Morgan's mind suddenly sharpened with a memory that had seemed insignificant at the time, but now felt potentially crucial to finding Amanda before it was too late. "Wait, about 6 months ago, my grandmother mentioned that one of her former men had been asking strange questions about a property Helen owned in the San Juan Islands, some cabin that's been in our family for years, but hasn't been used much recently." Riley's detective instincts immediately seized on this information, recognizing the potential significance of an isolated property owned by Helen Chen that the suspect might have known about through his surveillance of her activities and assets. "Do you know the address?" Riley asked urgently, already pulling out her phone to coordinate with Marcus and the FBI team. Morgan nodded, pulling up her phone and scrolling through old text messages from her grandmother until she found the property details Helen had sent months ago when she was considering selling the cabin. Riley forwarded the information to Marcus immediately, her heart racing with renewed hope that they might actually find Amanda Chen alive after 2 months of captivity, that this nightmare might have an ending that wasn't just death and tragedy for another family destroyed by a predator's obsession. Within minutes, Marcus confirmed that the FBI was mobilizing a tactical team to the island location, and Riley found herself torn between her duty to participate in the rescue operation and her desire to stay with Morgan and try to repair the damage her deception had caused to their fragile, complicated relationship that had somehow become the most important thing in her life despite its fraudulent origins. Riley made her choice without hesitation, recognizing that some things mattered more than professional obligations or career advancement in the grand scheme of a life well lived. "Come with me," she said to Morgan, extending her hand in an invitation that transcended their complicated history and offered a path forward through shared purpose rather than romantic resolution. "Amanda is your cousin, and you have every right to be there when we bring her home. Besides, you know the property and the area, which could be valuable for the tactical approach." Morgan looked surprised by the invitation but stood immediately, her hand finding Riley's with a natural ease that had developed between them over weeks of practiced and genuine affection. They left the hotel together, Morgan pausing only to tell her grandmother where they were going and receiving Helen's blessing along with a knowing look that suggested the elderly woman understood far more about her granddaughter's feelings than Morgan had ever explicitly shared. The drive to the ferry terminal was tense and mostly silent, both women processing the traumatic events of the evening while preparing mentally for what they might find at the isolated cabin where Amanda Chen had potentially been held captive for 2 months. Riley kept one hand on the steering wheel and the other clasped with Morgan's across the center console, a connection that felt essential to maintaining her emotional equilibrium as she headed toward another potentially violent confrontation that could end with more death or with the miracle of finding Amanda alive against all odds. The FBI tactical team was already on site when Riley and Morgan arrived at the remote cabin property on San Juan Island, having made the crossing by helicopter while Riley and Morgan had taken the last ferry of the evening and driven through the dark island roads guided by GPS and Morgan's childhood memories of visiting this property with her extended family. Marcus met them at the perimeter that had been established around the cabin, his expression grim but determined as he briefed Riley on what they had discovered so far through surveillance and initial reconnaissance. The cabin shows signs of recent occupation. Lights on inside, a generator running, and thermal imaging indicates at least one person in the main room, though we can't tell if it's a hostage, an accomplice we didn't know about, or just a squatter who happened to pick this property by coincidence? Riley nodded, absorbing the tactical information while her detective mind cataloged the implications and possibilities. The suspect is dead, she reminded Marcus. So unless he had a partner we didn't identify, that person inside is most likely Amanda Chen, possibly injured or restrained in ways that prevent her from leaving on her own. Marcus agreed with her assessment, but cautioned that they needed to approach carefully given the unknowns about the situation and the potential for booby traps or other dangers that the suspect might have left behind to protect his captive from discovery or rescue. Riley turned to Morgan, whose face was pale but determined in the dim light cast by the tactical team's equipment and vehicles. "You should stay here with the command post," Riley said gently, not wanting to expose Morgan to the potential dangers or traumatic sights that might wait inside the cabin. But Morgan shook her head firmly, her jaw set with the same stubborn determination Riley had come to recognize over their weeks together. "Amanda is my family," Morgan said quietly, but with steel beneath the words. "And if she's been held captive for 2 months by that monster, she's going to be terrified and traumatized, and she might not trust a bunch of armed strangers even if you're there to rescue her. She needs to see a familiar face, someone from the family who can tell her she's safe now and that her nightmare is finally over." Riley understood Morgan's logic and respected her courage, even as every protective instinct screamed at her to keep Morgan far away from whatever horrors might be waiting inside that cabin. They compromised with Morgan agreeing to stay behind the initial tactical entry team, but joining the scene immediately once it was secured and declared safe for civilian presence. Marcus gave the signal, and the FBI agents moved forward in practiced formation, approaching the cabin with weapons drawn and announcing their law enforcement presence in voices that carried authority and carried across the quiet island night. The entry was anticlimactic compared to the violence at the hotel. The cabin door was unlocked, and inside they found Amanda Chen alive, conscious, and chained to a bed in conditions that made Riley's stomach turn with rage at what this woman had endured for 2 months at the hands of a predator who had justified his cruelty as revenge against Helen Chen's empowerment of women. Amanda was emaciated and clearly traumatized, her eyes wide with fear even as the FBI agents worked to remove her restraints and assure her that she was safe now, that her captor was dead, that her ordeal was finally over after 60 days of captivity and abuse. Morgan pushed past the agents as soon as they gave the all-clear, dropping to her knees beside Amanda's bed and taking her cousin's trembling hands while speaking softly in Mandarin, words of comfort and family connection that seemed to penetrate Amanda's shock more effectively than the agents' professional assurances. Riley stood back and watched Morgan comfort her cousin, feeling the weight of 3 years of obsessive investigation finally lifting from her shoulders now that both missing women had been accounted for, Jennifer Thompson found and laid to rest with dignity, and Amanda Chen found alive and beginning the long journey toward recovery and healing. The case was closed, the predator was dead, and Riley should have felt triumphant or at least satisfied with the resolution, but instead she just felt exhausted and empty, aware that solving the case hadn't fixed anything broken inside herself or resolved the complicated feelings she had developed for Morgan during their weeks of deception and genuine connection. Paramedics arrived to transport Amanda to the hospital, and Morgan insisted on riding with her cousin in the ambulance while Riley coordinated with Marcus and the FBI team to process the crime scene and document evidence of Amanda's captivity. The cabin yielded disturbing proof of the suspect's obsession with Helen Chen, walls covered with photos of Helen and the women she had mentored, journals filled with rambling manifestos about feminist corruption and the destruction of traditional family values, and detailed plans for future abductions that would never be carried out now that the predator was dead. Riley found evidence that confirmed the suspect's identity as David Morrison, a man whose wife had indeed been one of Helen's early ments decades ago, a successful architect who had divorced Morrison after years of what court records suggested was emotional abuse and controlling behavior. Morrison had blamed Helen for his wife's decision to leave him, and when his ex-wife had died by suicide 5 years after the divorce, Morrison's grief and rage had crystallized into an obsessive need for revenge against Helen and everything she represented in terms of women's independence and empowerment. The investigation would take weeks to fully document and process, But the essential truth was clear. Morrison had been systematically destroying Helen's legacy one successful woman at a time, punishing Helen for daring to tell women they deserved better than men who sought to control and diminish them. Riley didn't see Morgan again until 3 days after Amanda's rescue, when Morgan texted her asking to meet at the same coffee shop where their relationship had begun, with Riley responding to Morgan's desperate internet advertisement for a fake fiancé. Riley arrived early again, claiming the same corner table with the same anxious anticipation she had felt during that first meeting, though now she knew Morgan in ways that made the stakes feel infinitely higher and more personal. Morgan arrived looking tired but more settled than she had in the immediate aftermath of the birthday party confrontation and her cousin's dramatic rescue from captivity. They ordered coffee and sat in awkward silence for a moment before Morgan spoke, her voice soft but clear. "I talked to my grandmother about everything, about you, about us, about the lies and the investigation, and the feelings that somehow became real despite the fraudulent foundation." Riley waited, barely breathing as she tried to read Morgan's expression and prepare herself for whatever verdict Morgan had reached about their relationship and its potential future. "Helen told me that sometimes the best relationships start from unexpected places, and that what matters isn't how we met or what brought us together, but what we choose to do with the connection we've discovered between us despite all the complications and deceptions." Morgan reached across the table and took Riley's hand, the gesture familiar now after weeks of practiced and genuine affection, and Riley felt hope flutter tentatively in her chest for the first time since the shooting had forced all their secrets into the open. "I'm still hurt about the lies," Morgan said honestly, her eyes meeting Riley's with the direct communication that had always characterized their interactions even when everything else was built on deception. "And I think we need to start over in some ways. Build a relationship based on honesty instead of investigation and fake engagements and family performances." Riley nodded, squeezing Morgan's hand and finding her voice despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm her careful control. "I would like that very much," Riley said quietly. "No more lies, no more cases coming between us. Just two women trying to figure out if what we found together is strong enough to survive the transition from fake to real." Morgan smiled, the first genuine smile Riley had seen from her since the birthday party, and suggested they start with something simple, a real first date. No performances or deceptions required, just dinner and conversation between two people who already knew each other's worst secrets and darkest moments. Riley agreed immediately, feeling lighter than she had in years as the case that had consumed her life finally released its hold and allowed space for something new and hopeful to grow in the emptiness it left behind. 6 months later, Riley found herself standing in Helen Chen's living room surrounded by Morgan's extended family for a very different kind of gathering than the birthday party that had changed everything in both their lives. Amanda Chen was there too, thinner than she had been before her abduction but healing steadily with the support of therapy, family, and the knowledge that her captor would never hurt anyone again. Helen sat in her favorite chair looking friendlier than she had at her birthday, but with the same sharp, knowing eyes that had seen through Riley's deception from the very beginning and had chosen to allow it anyway because she recognized something genuine beneath the lies. The family had gathered to celebrate the holidays, a tradition that Helen insisted on maintaining despite her declining health, and Riley attended as Morgan's actual girlfriend rather than her fake fiancé, a distinction that felt both significant and somewhat amusing given their unconventional origin story. Morgan stood beside Riley with easy comfort, their hands intertwined naturally as they had been so many times during their weeks of performance, except now every touch was real and chosen freely rather than rehearsed for an audience's benefit. Riley had been nervous about attending this family gathering as herself rather than as Sarah, worried that the relatives who had met her under false pretenses would resent the deception or judge her harshly for the lies she had maintained even while investigating threats to their community. But Helen had handled the truth with characteristic grace and wisdom, explaining to the family that Riley had been working undercover to protect them from a predator who targeted their community, and that Morgan's relationship with Riley had developed organically despite its fraudulent origins. The family had been surprisingly accepting once they understood the full context, particularly after Amanda shared her gratitude to Riley for the years of obsessive investigation that had ultimately saved her life and brought her captor to justice. Riley's relationship with Morgan had evolved slowly and carefully over the 6 months since they had agreed to start fresh with honesty as their foundation. They had gone on actual dates, dinners, movies, weekend trips to the San Juan Islands where they could hike and talk without the weight of investigation or deception hanging over their conversations. Riley had introduced Morgan to her younger sister, mending that fractured relationship with apologies and explanations about how the Thompson case had consumed her life to the detriment of everything else she valued. Morgan had helped Riley find better balance between her work and her personal life, gently reminding her when she started slipping back into obsessive patterns that threatened to eclipse the healing she had begun after finally closing the case that had defined her career for 3 years. They had learned each other all over again, this time without scripts or performances, discovering that the connection they had felt during their fake engagement was even stronger when built on truth and vulnerability. Helen called Riley over to her chair during a quiet moment when most of the family was in the kitchen preparing dinner, and Riley sat on the ottoman beside the elderly woman who had been so central to everything that had happened in Riley's life over the past year. "Thank you for saving my girls," Helen said quietly, her hand reaching out to clasp Riley's with surprising strength. "Jennifer, Amanda, Morgan's cousin from the party, you gave them back their futures and their freedom, and you stopped a monster who was trying to destroy everything I built to help women like them thrive and succeed." Riley felt tears burning in her eyes as she accepted Helen's gratitude, understanding the weight of responsibility this woman had carried for decades as she mentored and elevated hundreds of young women while a predator used her success against her as justification for his violence. "I'm sorry I couldn't save Jennifer," Riley said, the guilt of that failure still raw despite the successful rescue of Amanda and the prevention of future abductions. Helen shook her head gently, her expression full of compassion for Riley's self-imposed burden of responsibility. "You found her and brought her home to her family so they could have closure and peace," Helen said firmly. "That matters, Detective Hayes, even when we cannot save everyone we fight to protect from the darkness in this world." Morgan joined them, settling on the arm of Helen's chair and putting a hand on her grandmother's shoulder with the easy affection of someone who had always been close to this remarkable woman. "Are you two conspiring without me?" Morgan asked with mock suspicion, and Riley saw Helen's eyes light up with amusement at her granddaughter's playful tone. "I was just telling Riley how glad I am that you found each other," Helen said, looking between them with obvious satisfaction. "Even if the path that brought you together was unconventional and involved more deception than I typically approve of in romantic relationships." Morgan laughed, her hand finding Riley's and squeezing gently in the shared understanding of two people who had built something real from fraudulent beginnings. "I never did get to use the fake engagement story I created," Morgan said Riley. "After everything that happened at your birthday party, explaining that Riley was actually a detective and not my fiancé seemed more important than maintaining the original lie about how we met." Helen smiled knowingly, her gaze sharp despite her physical frailty. "I prefer the truth anyway," she said. "The story of how a desperate woman posted an advertisement for a fake bride and accidentally found real love with a detective investigating serial abductions is far more interesting than whatever fiction you had constructed about meeting at a dinner party." As the family gathering continued around them, Riley reflected on how much her life had changed in the year since she had responded to Morgan's cryptic internet post, seeking an actress for a family event. The Thompson case was closed, both victims accounted for and their families given answers and justice, even if those answers came with unbearable grief. Riley had received a commendation for her work on the investigation despite the unorthodox methods and personal complications, and she had been promoted to lead detective in the Major Crimes Unit, where she could channel her investigative intensity into new cases without the obsessive tunnel vision that had nearly destroyed her during the Thompson years. More importantly, she had Morgan, a relationship that challenged her to be vulnerable and present in ways she had avoided throughout her career by hiding behind work and cases that kept other people at a safe emotional distance. Morgan had moved some of her things into Riley's apartment after 4 months of dating, a gradual merging of lives that felt natural and right despite Riley's lifetime of fierce independence and solitude. They were building something real together, learning each other's rhythms and needs, supporting each other through the trauma recovery that both of them needed after the violence and revelations of Helen's birthday party. Amanda approached Riley later in the evening, her steps still slightly hesitant, but her smile genuine as she navigated the family gathering with visible determination to reclaim normalcy after months of captivity and trauma. "I wanted to thank you properly," Amanda said quietly, pulling Riley slightly away from the main group for a moment of privacy. "I know you've heard it before, but I need you to understand that you saved my life, not just physically by finding me, but by caring enough to never give up on the investigation even when everyone else had moved on from Jennifer's case." Riley felt emotion tightening her throat as she looked at this young woman who had survived horrors that would have broken most people and was somehow finding the strength to heal and move forward. "I'm just glad we found you in time," Riley said honestly. "I've spent my career trying to save people, and I don't always succeed. You and your cousin from the party are alive because Morgan remembered that cabin, so if you want to thank anyone, thank her for having the presence of mind to make that connection when it mattered most." Amanda smiled and nodded but insisted, "You both saved me, Morgan with her memory and love, and you with your dedication and skill, and I hope you know how grateful the whole family is for everything you've done, even if we didn't know you were doing it for most of that time." As the evening drew to a close and family members began saying their goodbyes, Riley and Morgan stood together on Helen's front porch looking out at the Seattle skyline lit up against the dark winter sky. "Are you happy?" Morgan asked softly, the question carrying weight beyond simple inquiry about Riley's mood in this specific moment. Riley considered the question seriously, taking inventory of her life and recognizing with some surprise that she was genuinely content in ways she had never achieved during her years of obsessive casework and emotional isolation. "I am," Riley said honestly, pulling Morgan closer against the cold evening air. "I spent so long defining myself by the cases I solved and the victims I couldn't save, but being with you has taught me that there's more to life than work and guilt and endless pursuit of justice for every wrong in the world." Morgan leaned into Riley's embrace, her head resting on Riley's shoulder in the comfortable silence of two people who no longer needed to perform or pretend. "I love you," Morgan said, the words simple but carrying the weight of truth hard-won through deception, danger, and the choice to build something real from the wreckage of lies. "I love you too," Riley replied, the confession easier than she had expected after a lifetime of keeping emotional walls carefully maintained. They stayed on the porch for a long moment, holding each other and watching the city lights, two women who had found each other through a fake engagement advertisement and discovered that sometimes the best love stories begin with deception but transform into truth through courage, honesty, and the willingness to choose each other again and again despite every complication and obstacle fate throws in their path.